SNP.
Here, here.
Do you want me to wait, Matt?
Right, please leave quietly. Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was it something I said? Like snow off a dike. I wish to begin, as is customary, Mr. Speaker, by passing on my thanks to King Charles and the Queen for their most gracious speech today. I'm sure it was a very momentous occasion for them both. I've been goaded a wee bit about my flower, Mr. Speaker, but notwithstanding that, I intend to start by offering some consensus across the chamber, because I believe that is incredibly important in these times. Firstly, in relation to Ukraine, because it is, of course, fast approaching the 2-year anniversary of Vladimir Putin's decision to enter Ukraine in an extremely forceful manner, to start a war, to kill civilians and to attack Ukraine's democracy, of course, building upon the footsteps that he had laid in 2014 by invading and annexing Crimea. Now, it's been said in the public domain that the resolve of the West is perhaps shaking in the face of the fact that the conflict continues. But I think we are all united across this chamber, right across parties, about the fact that we are steadfast in our commitment to the Ukrainian people in their fight to protect their democracy against that most abhorrent of tyrants. And, Mr. Speaker, we say that because these are our values. It's what we believe in. We believe in peace, we believe in protecting civilians, and we believe in democracy. And, of course, that view that we have extends beyond just Ukraine. It extends to the situation in Israel and Gaza too. Now, I know I'm at risk of repeating myself here, as indeed many of us do in this chamber from time to time, but I think it is important to reiterate that all of us in this chamber are, of course, united in our unequivocal condemnation of what Hamas did exactly a month ago. There can never be a justification for the senseless killing of men, women and children in the way that that terrorist organisation did. Now, what we've seen on the back of that on our streets is equally, not perhaps as equally, but it is, of course, as concerning, Mr. Speaker, the rise of anti-Semitism, the fear that so many people have been able to walk the streets of these isles is something which I think we all have grave concerns about. And I want to send my heartfelt support to all of those in the Jewish community, and to make it very clear, if indeed it ever needed to be clear, that we all oppose anti-Semitism. No ifs and no buts. And just finally on that point, Mr. Speaker, I think what we all so urgently want to see is diplomacy in action in order to see the release of the hostages that are still in Hamas's control. There can be, as I have said in relation to other matters, no justification for that, and we all want to see those people returned to their families as quickly as possible. And as I've said previously, I wish the Prime Minister well in that diplomatic pursuit. Mr. Speaker, of course, the conflict in Israel and Gaza cannot be forgotten without, of course, mentioning what we are seeing in Gaza itself. Thousands upon thousands of people have been killed. People don't have access to food, they don't have access to clean water, they don't have access to fuel, they cannot turn on the lights, they don't have access to medicine. In many instances, the hospitals that they go to no longer exist. The schools that they once went to no longer exist. The universities that they once went to no longer exist. What we are seeing, and I think this is perhaps where the agreement across the floor perhaps goes away, what we are seeing is collective punishment. And what we so badly need to see, Mr. Speaker, is a humanitarian ceasefire. No, not a humanitarian pause which fills people's bellies to then be blown up again in the days to follow. What we believe in unequivocally as a humanitarian ceasefire. And I sincerely hope that members across this chamber will join us in coming to that position in the not-too-distant future. Because, Mr Speaker, those are our values. We believe in peace and we believe in the protection of civilians. Now, Mr Speaker, to the King's speech itself, I was listening very closely, like others were, and I heard the term economic growth used. And, you know, that intrigued me, because we all know that Britain's broke and Brexit broke it. But we so obviously need economic growth. And for those of us on these benches, there is an obvious solution on this front. There's perhaps 3 or 4 things that we could and should do. Now, they may not be popular with members on certainly the government side and indeed some on the official opposition side, but they are necessary, because all of us, I think, would agree that in order to have economic growth, what you need and what you have to see is the tax base expanded. So the easiest way to do that is to actually increase working age migration into these isles. But beyond that, it's to ensure that the businesses that we all want to see thrive are able to export directly to the biggest markets possible. In our case, there's one sitting just across the channel, the EU single market, Mr Speaker. And I think we should be a bit more robust and confident about saying that not only do we need more migration on these isles, we need access to that EU single market. And, Mr Speaker, the argument that the Prime Minister would put forward would be that the agreement, the trade deal that was reached with our friends in Asia is the start of something better. Well, how do we look? And that trade deal is worth 0.08% of GDP. So they would need 50 of those trade deals just to match the 4% hit caused by leaving the European Union. But of course, beyond migration, beyond access to the single market, another way to guarantee economic growth is to enshrine the rights of workers into law through the likes of an employment bill. And, Mr Speaker, it is a damned disgrace that since 2017 this government has been promising an employment bill and is still not delivered. Mr Speaker, the fourth strand to achieve economic growth, if colleagues were so willing, would be to double down on investment in net zero, to do as the Americans are doing, to follow the lead of Joe Biden with the Inflation Reduction Act. It makes sense. It makes sense to invest in the technologies of tomorrow so that you don't get left behind, so that you can compete for the decades to come. Net zero is not a hindrance, it's a growth opportunity. Now, I'm pleased that in the speech that we have had today, we've seen an indication that the grid is to be upgraded. That is to be welcomed, long overdue as it is. But what we don't have is any insight as to whether there's going to be a financial mechanism put in place to deliver hydro pump storage in Scotland at Cruachan or Corrie Glass. There's no indication if there's going to be further or new financial mechanisms to support tidal power in Scotland, which is world leading. There's no indication that there's going to be financial mechanisms in place to deliver green hydrogen at scale, not just for people on these isles, but right across the European continent. There was no indication whatsoever that this government is going to fix the failure of the offshore wind auction round, which delivered not a single bid this year. A shameful indictment and damaging, so damaging to Scotland's burgeoning renewables sector. But for folks sitting at home, Mr Speaker, none of this is tangible, none of this is real. Because people living in Scotland, we're an energy-rich nation, and yet they're living in fuel poverty. We already produce 6 times more gas than we consume, yet people can't afford to turn on their heating. In 2022, we produced enough energy, enough electricity to power all the homes in Scotland for 3.5 years, yet people can't afford to keep the lights on. Now, there was 2 things that the government could have done to support those people. What the government could have done was finally separate the cost of gas from the cost of electricity to protect consumers immediately. And the second thing they could and should have done was to reinstate the £400 energy bill rebate, because we know that people are going to be worse off this year than last. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. Now, they may not be popular in this place, but we will continue to champion them because they are our values. But the challenges people face, Mr. Speaker, extends beyond just their energy bills. It goes to their mortgage bills too. Why is there no action? Why is there no action in relation to mortgage relief? Why is there no action in relation to a price on some staple foods in the supermarkets? Now, it was indicated by a member of the government, that's communism. Well, someone should have told Emmanuel Macron, because the French have done it. They've managed to protect their citizens. Why is it good enough for them, but not good enough for us? And ultimately, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the cost of living crisis in its total, when we look at it in its entirety, it exists because of decisions taken in this place. The reason people can't afford to pay their energy bills is because decades of incompetence on energy policy from this place. The reason that people can't afford to pay their mortgage bills is because the Tories crashed the economy. The reason that people can't afford to pay their food bills is because Brexit pushed up the prices delivered by politicians in this place, Mr. Speaker. And we've had enough of it, Mr. Speaker. We've had, of course.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, for the honourable gentleman giving way. He spoke at length about energy and never once mentioned oil. He represents Aberdeen North. I wonder when the government's bill on oil and gas licences comes to this chamber, will he stand up for his constituents of Aberdeen South and vote with the government, or will he support the SNP position, which is to turn their back on oil and gas workers?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member for Murray is always one for detail, but I represent Aberdeen South, not Aberdeen North. But Mr. Speaker, I think it's just 7 days. It's just 7 days since the government announced 27 licences for offshore oil and gas, and now they've came forward with a proposal to do so on an annual basis. Now, what I would like to see, Mr. Speaker, as I hear the honourable gentleman chuntering for a sedentary position, like a wee Dafty. Mr. Speaker, if he was to choose to listen, I will get to my point. What he knows, I believe, is that there has to be an evidence-based approach to oil and gas extraction. An evidence-based approach which is anathema to this government. What we need to be considering is our energy security. What we need to be considering is our commitment to net zero. What we need to be considering is jobs and opportunities. And of course, what we need to be considering is that investment in renewables going forward. Now, what I would like to see the government do, and I'm sure the honourable member would agree with me in this regard, is obviously to ensure that the pre-existing licences for the likes of offshore wind, where the government has failed, we see improvements to ensure that that actually happens, Mr. Speaker. Now, the people of Scotland, when they're looking at this and they see the cost of living challenges and they know that it emanates from the decisions taken in this place, their minds are very much refocused on the fact that where power is devolved, Mr. Speaker, power is retained. And what we need to see, what we so badly need to see, is the powers over our economy, the powers over energy policy, the powers over employment law transferred from this place to Holyrood. And here's why, Mr. Speaker, because when we look at the record of Holyrood in comparison to this place, the difference could not be starker. If you're a young person in Scotland, you'll be born into a baby box. If you go to nursery, you'll receive 1,140 hours of care. If you go to primary school, you'll get a free school meal. If you go to secondary school and want to go to higher education, that will be paid for you. If you then enter the workplace in Scotland, if you become a nurse, you'll be paid more than you are here. The majority of Scots pay less tax than those in England. On your council tax, you'll pay less than those living in England. You'll be able to get crisp, clean water included as part of that bill, Mr. Speaker. Of course, if you want to be in a situation... Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is very keen. Would you like to rise to his feet?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way again. He's spoken a lot about economic growth. I wonder then, does he agree with several SNP backbenchers that there should be no place in the SNP Scottish Government for the Greens because they're anti-economic growth?
Mr. Speaker, I believe I was talking about nationalised water in Scotland. Now, it's not just nationalised water in Scotland, it's of course the fact that our railways are nationalised as well. If you want to open a business in Scotland, you'll have access to the small business bonus, and as you get older, you will be able to live in comfort knowing that you'll have access to free personal care. All those things have came about because those are our values. They're tangible and they're real, and what the Scottish Parliament has done is deliver them. And what is going to deliver next is that council tax freeze. A council tax freeze which comes in the face of some Labour councillors in Scotland advocating for a 32% rise in council tax, because only the SNP, using the powers that we have, are protecting the Scottish people during the cost of living crisis, in stark contrast to the failing establishment here in front of us, Mr. Speaker. But of course, it's not all bad news, Mr. Speaker, because we do have one glimmer of hope. The fact that this is not just the Prime Minister's first speech, it's the Prime Minister's last King's speech.